are coming. So the session will be recorded. We will manage the CEUs as follows. If you're attending and hoping to get CEU credits, I'd ask that you please put your name and certification number, including the state, in the chat now. If you could also include your email address, that would make life easier for us, but it's not a be all end all if you don't have that quickly available to you, but it makes life a little bit easier for us for some of the states in terms of submissions. Amber, I don't think I have the ability to advance the slides. Do you mind giving me that permission real quick, and then we'll get started?
You
There
should
we
be good
go.
now. Yep.
Yep, perfect. All right. So I just want to take a minute and introduce today's presenters to you. I'll begin with Amber Funk, who is a regulatory consultant at Rosetree Consulting. Amber grew up on a swine farm in Franklin County. And after college, she chose to stay in the ag world and began working for an ag research company. And she spent 7 years there prior to moving to the Monroe County Conservation District as their ag technician. Amber, since that time, has decided to move back into the private sector in order to work with more farms across the state. And she's been working as a private nutrient management planner for the past 5 years with Rosetree as well as with Red Barn Consulting. Jedd Montcavage is a 1999 graduate of Penn State University. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Soil Science. He's a certified nutrient management specialist in several states, as well as a registered NRCS technical service provider in several states as well. And he's also a nationally certified soil scientist. Jedd has 25 years of experience in the field and serves as the vice president at TeamAg Incorporated, overseeing a team of 9 planners and within the company's environmental consulting department. So with that, I will turn it over to Amber, who will begin our presentation by talking about injection and the nutrient management considerations of injection. And then she's going to cover the nitrogen aspects of manure injection. And then Jedd is going to take over and talk about some of the phosphorus considerations. If you do have questions throughout the presentation, I would ask that you use the Q&A code there. That'll help us keep our chat with your CEU information separate from the questions. We will monitor that as we go throughout the presentation and ask questions at the relevant sections of the presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Amber. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooke. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. As Brooke said, I'm going to be talking specifically on the nitrogen side of things in regards to adopting injection and kind of what that looks like. So on this first slide, you can see there's a couple of questions, and really this is what goes through my mind as a planner when someone calls and says, hey, I'm thinking about doing injection on my farm. One of my first questions is, okay, that's really great. What is the goal? What are we trying to achieve with injection? Are we looking to be a good neighbor? Are we looking to prioritize nitrogen usage? Those have major impacts in regards to, okay, are we looking just for spring applications? Are we looking for fall applications? What is our goal here? Again, some of that relates to, is the farm able to have a lot of flexibility in their application? So the injection manure use, how does the injection change the total manure that can be used on the farm? So we're looking at, does it increase our application rates? Does it decrease our application rates? Does the farm have that flexibility, as I mentioned beforehand, to play with things for the manure injection? Or are they really tight? Are they really limited on what they can do? Sometimes that will limit whether they can do injection on everything that they're looking for, or maybe they can only try injection on a portion of their operation. And again, as we're trying to play with the numbers, what application rates work, what isn't going to work, we're looking at how does the operations yield impact the ability to use application with the injection method or the application rates. So one of the important things for injection and using it, especially for nitrogen, is thinking about the nitrogen availability. The nitrogen that is you're getting from the manure from your applications, we're really looking at it's impacted by our application season. It's impacted by the season of when the crop is actually going to utilize it. Are we applying it in the fall, but the crop is utilizing it in the spring? Or are we applying it in the spring and the crop is using it in the spring or the summer? And then it's also highly impacted whether it's incorporated, in the injection or it's just surface applied. So the next thing, if you haven't seen this, I'm sure you've seen it in some way, shape, or form. This specific box is from the Nutrient Management Tech Manual, but in this case, it's the nitrogen availability charts. So just to briefly look at this, we're not going to go deeply into this. We would spend a lot of time, and I'm sure Charlie White could spend even more time on it with you guys. But for here, we're looking at in the top box the spring summer utilization here. And I just want to point out the difference in the ammonium nitrogen that's going to be available to the crop, whether we incorporate it. So that's that immediately, kind of section there, or whether it's greater than 7 days, which is a typical surface broadcast application. So you can see there's a vast difference in what is actually going to be available for the crop to use from the manure application. Now, if we look and we compare, an early fall or a late fall application that's going to be used by a summer crop like corn, you can see that there isn't any ammonium nitrogen credit. So essentially at that point, you're focusing on any organic nitrogen credits that you're getting from previous manure application or manure application history for these crops. And all of those come into play when we're talking about total nitrogen being applied and how we're getting that from the manure and the total manure application and gallonage that you can apply for these farms and fields. So our first example that we're going to use is a pretty typical a swine manure analysis here, 40 pounds of total nitrogen, 23 pounds of ammonium nitrogen, almost 19 pounds of phosphorus. So just a typical finishing swine operation. So for our first scenario here, we're going to use a corn grain crop. Pretty simple. I know it does say low phosphorus, but in this scenario, it's less than 200. So Jedd's going to mostly talk about things that are over 200. So for here, we're using, a phosphorus of 118 parts per million. To keep things simple, we are doing, no previous legume history and also just a continuous manure history, which is fairly common for, a lot of swine operations. So for someone calls and they're saying, this is what I want to do. I want to use the equipment that I have can do 6,000 gallons of injection. And this is our scenario. Okay. We run the numbers and we say, all right, your yield is about 180 bushels. Now, if we put in all of our backgrounding information, we can look and we can see that our three different application timings or application types, um, here's what we would be able to apply, or here's what we would need to apply in gallons of manure to achieve the total nitrogen needs for the crop for 180 bushels in this scenario. So we can see that if we are using injection, we can only apply, 5,700 gallons. If we're doing a surface application, that's 10,000. Or if we're doing a fall application, a late fall application, we would need to apply almost 18,000 gallons of manure to achieve our goal of 180 bushel corn. So in this case, our 6,000 gallons wouldn't necessarily work for a spring injection application. If we have a 220 bushel yield, we can see here we can now apply 7,200 gallons with injection, or 12,000 surface broadcast, or if we do a fall, it's 22,000. Now, again, no application is to exceed 9,000 gallons per individual application, as we all know from the regulations. So again, this is just the amount of manure that you would need to apply if you were to achieve, your 220 bushel acre corn in this specific scenario. So this is where we can see that the yield of the operation does impact what application rate we can use. And so thinking or asking questions about the equipment, about the application rates that you can do is very important early on in the planning stage because that can impact whether or not you're actually moving forward with the injection or whether we need to do, say, something else in the planning side to make that 6,000 gallon application work. So in this scenario, we go slightly back to the 180 bushels. So we are doing a continuous manure history, as I said, which is just one of the standard selections within our planning options. And in that situation, we are accrediting 35 pounds of nitrogen from the previous manure applications. So with that, we can only do, as I mentioned last on the last slide, 57, 100 gallons. That doesn't meet our 6,000 gallon needs. So one of the things that we can do is we can be slightly more specific and we can input the actual manure application history. Now, in this scenario, what I did is I actually did 5 year, 6,000 gallon application rate for history. And so now this is taking into account that manure analysis that we mentioned before, rather than using, a standard value. And in this case, we're actually only getting a 23-pound credit rather than a 35-pound credit. And so now we can apply 6,000 gallons of manure as an injection. So if there are certain scenarios where someone is, really limited by their application equipment, but they would like to use the injection, that's something that they are looking for, say because they really need it for odor control and their neighbors. They're trying to be really good neighbors and rather than have their neighbor complain, they're like, I would like to do this, but the application that I can rent or the application equipment that I can use, I can only do 6,000 gallons with my equipment. So this is one way that we can try and add in additional information to hopefully raise the application rate a little bit. Our next scenario is a dairy manure analysis in a dairy scenario. So you can see, really the big differences in the manure analysis between the swine and the dairy here, a much lower total nitrogen, much lower total, ammonium value here and as phosphorus as well. Again, this is a pretty standard just dairy liquid analysis here. We're going to be using the same cropping scenario, so corn grain, that lower phosphorus, no previous legume, and again, a continuous manure history. So in this scenario, we can use 8,000 gallons for our application rate. It's a little bit higher, and you can see there isn't any issue when we're doing that 180 bushel corn. We can use 8,000 gallons whether we're doing a spring injection. We could use 8,000 whether we're doing surface or if we were doing a fall application as well. So in this scenario, there really isn't any difference between the 220 to the 180 bushels. But again, that goes back to how much is actually available in the manure analysis itself. So again, you can see the difference here is really just in how much more manure you would need to meet your actual nitrogen needs for the crop that you have. Now, dairy manure, dairy farms, corn grain, continuous corn grain isn't likely the only thing that you'll see. So a lot of times you do also see that double crop rotation, small grain silage, corn silage. So I did have that here as well. So you can just see. So in this example, 7-ton small grain silage, a double crop, 25-ton corn silage here. So we also know that most dairy operations, especially if you're doing a double crop scenario, you are going to have an manure application on the small grain and you're going to have a manure application on the corn silage as well. So to show that you would maybe still be able to do this or to show how you're also impacted by those organic contributions, you can see that for the surface application for the small grains, you would need a much higher application of manure to achieve your nitrogen needs in comparison to your injection needs for the corn silage. So to briefly interlude before Jedd goes and explains everything in the specifics, what happens when the phosphorus is high? So I would like to focus mainly on from the nitrogen side, what happens when the phosphorus is high, and Jedd will talk about it from the phosphorus side. So in this example, again, I'm going to go slightly back to the swine manure, and I'm choosing the swine manure rather than the dairy manure because that is um, one of the manure types where we see kind of the most, what's the, like it's the most beneficial because the phosphorus is high in the manure and you have a higher ammonium nitrogen. So when you're playing around with numbers or when you're trying to see what's best or what can be most beneficial for a farmer, you're really going to see those impacts when you are more limited by the manure type as well. So dairy manure isn't quite as high. You don't have as many issues, but swine manure, duck liquid, those would be the two that you would see this really having an impact. So in this situation, 200 bushel corn, 220 bushel corn here, the same as last time. It has the same nitrogen requirements. But in this scenario, we're doing pretty basic 250 parts per million phosphorus, and it is less than 150 feet from a stream. Well-drained soils, so pretty basic what you would see within the phosphorus index there. So if we go back, you would see that these values for the nitrogen needs and the manure application rates to achieve that are exactly the same as what they were before, right? The nitrogen needs of the corn doesn't change whether or not it's 150 feet from a stream or it's 500 feet from a stream. So you can see those values are all still the same. However, we go back to our 6,000 gallons is our application rate that we're looking for. But in this scenario, we can do 6,000 gallons with injection. But when we actually run everything and enter in all of the information, our surface application, even though we need 12,000 gallons, we can only apply 4,000. And that's because it's limited by the high phosphorus. It's limited by the phosphorus index, which Jen will go into all of the factors that go into that. But in this situation, it's limited. So now we're looking at the contributions. And in this situation, we're saying, oh, well, we can inject 6,000. We're contributing 161 pounds of nitrogen to the crop. But in the surface application, we're only contributing 62 pounds to. So that means we need an additional side dress application, maybe, we need to come back and think of other ways to add nitrogen to the crop. And we're also using less manure. So we're using less manure, we have to add additional nitrogen. And so in this situation, injection might not be something that was originally thought of for this field or this field, but we can choose what is best and what makes sense economically. And so some of these impacts are one of those ways, other than just thinking, do you have enough land? Can we do injections? Are you doing this to be a good neighbor? Are you doing this for nitrogen usage? So sometimes nitrogen use isn't the first thought. It's how can I just use all of my manure? And injection is one way to do that. So again, this is just if you have higher phosphorus concerns, injection is a good way to think about it. So that way, in this scenario specifically, you can do your application based on your nitrogen needs rather than your phosphorus limitations. So,
Amber, we have a question here
okay,
um,
I'll do my
about
best.
about manure sources. Is when
Yes.
you're thinking about injection, are there certain manure sources, dairy, swine, whatever, that are harder to plan for with respect to injection?
Absolutely, absolutely. Dairy manure is typically never an issue from my experience, especially because you have a lot more flexibility in the application rates that you can use to meet your nitrogen needs. If we think back, we could say, oh, you can go 8,000. If we really looked at it, you could probably go even higher, right? You can probably do, I think, at least 8,500. So that gives you a higher range in what you can do. You can use different application. Your application equipment can have a broader range. Whereas if you're using duck liquid manure or swine manure, it tends to be very limiting just because the total nitrogen, the ammonium nitrogen rates are higher typically, so you're going to be able to put on less to get what you need. So you're limited in there. And I see it sometimes application rates of like 3,000, 4,000, which can be very difficult with injection application equipment. You know, you depending on where you are, the hills might be too hilly and you might not be able to actually pull the equipment fast enough to actually inject the manure to go at 3,000 gallons or 4,000 gallons. So having that conversation is definitely key. But yes, swine manure and duckwood manure tend to be the two that we have the most difficult in getting injection application rates, reasonable application rates.
And another question is if you're planning or if an operation is planning to do injection and for whatever reason they end up surface applying, or vice versa, how do you handle that from a record keeping standpoint for the operation? Like, how do you change the supplemental nitrogen rates and advise them in those kinds of situations where things are in flux, which we know happens on a lot of farms?
Yeah, so I think if you so obviously if we look back at everything, if you have an application rate and say it's 6,000 gallons, just because that's what we're using here, and you were planning on injecting it, but the person who has the injection equipment, they weren't available at the exact time when you needed it to, so you surface applied it at 6,000. We know that you are not going to have any concerns of over applying nitrogen when you're if it was originally planned for injection. So it essentially you're applying less nitrogen. That's not going to be the concern. You would maybe have a concern from a phosphorus standpoint, but we'll let Jedd answer any of those questions later. But in this case, one of the best things that I tell the farmers that I work with is if you have a question, the easiest thing for you to do is to honestly call me and I'll run the numbers and I can say, yep, you can do this. No, you cannot do that. Here's what you would need. Here's what you would need for that. So I it's a little different because I'm not looking at it from someone like from the record keeping side of things. But I do think that as long as you are mentioning how you are doing the applications, and then as long as you are taking that into account for your supplemental nitrogen and how you were either recording it or noting it, I think as long as you're not over applying nitrogen is the key component to that.
Thanks. All right, that's all the questions for now. Again, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them into the Q&A. I can't enter questions into the Q&A for some reason. I'm wondering if it's because I'm a host. I'm hoping that others who are participants can. If not, feel free to put them in the chat. But again, if you can use the Q&A, that's where we'd like those questions to go. So with that, I think we'll turn it over to Jedd to discuss a little bit more about the phosphorus considerations that we need to take into account when we are injecting manure.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I see a lot of familiar names out there from Pennsylvania Nutrient Management, and I see we have a lot of attendees from other states. Okay, here we go. I wasn't sure if I could control the slides or not. What is the phosphorus index? Simply put, it's a tool that we use to assess the risk of phosphorus movement from agricultural fields to surface waters. We're about 20 years into using the phosphorus index here in Pennsylvania, and I know surrounding states use similar tools as well. Our phosphorus indexes might not be exactly the same, but in general, they all use the same influencing factors in making the determination. A lot of factors go into the phosphorus index: soil phosphorus test level, proximity of the field to surface water, the watershed designation, whether or not it's a high quality or an exceptional value stream, any significant changes to the operation, if they're adding a new animal type, or making any significant changes to their manure management, the source and amount of phosphorus applied, the timing of the application, the method of the application, soil loss, the drainage, any subsurface artificial drainage or modified connectivity, all factors that go into making a phosphorus determination. So our soil phosphorus test levels, obviously, the higher the phosphorus test level, the more impact the index is going to have on the manure application. Here in Pennsylvania, if our fields exceed 200 parts per million on phosphorus, we need to run the phosphorus index, as well as the proximity of the field to surface waters. If the field is within 150 feet of surface waters, we need to run the index. That's the main screening tool for the phosphorus index here. And then also the timing of the application. Any of our winter applications, we have to run the phosphorus index on. So if we have fields that are less than 200 parts per million and they are greater than 150 feet from surface water and we're not doing winter application, we can automatically do a nitrogen-based rate. Our watershed designation here in Pennsylvania, if we're in an exceptional value or a high-quality watershed, we need to run the phosphorus index on all of our fields. And again, the significant changes, if we're adding an additional animal facet to the farm, if it's a dairy and it's adding poultry, or vice versa, or poultry and adding swine, we would need to run that index. Or if it's a brand new operation that didn't have livestock production before, we would have to run that index on all of our fields. So our source and amount of phosphorus, Amber talked a lot about, the different manure types. Typically we don't see as much of an impact with dairy manure. It's typically lower in phosphorus than our swine and poultry manures. The timing of the application, of course, are we doing it in the spring, fall, summer, winter? All have different impacts to the phosphorus index. Winter applications have the highest impact. Fall and spring and summer are a decreased impact. And then our method of application, of course, are we surface applying it? Are we surface applying it and incorporating it within a certain amount of time, or are we injecting it? Injection has a decreased impact on the phosphorus index. That can be directly related to how soil loss plays into the phosphorus index. The higher our soil loss on the field, the higher the impact is on the index. The majority of phosphorus loss is tied directly to soil loss. So utilizing injection can better support no-till systems, which reduces our soil loss and reduces the impact on the phosphorus index. So our soil drainage and runoff, poorly drained soils have a higher impact on the phosphorus index versus well-drained soils. Subsurface or artificial drainage, if the field is tiled, that will have an increased impact on the phosphorus index score. And modified connectivity, if we have piped outlet terraces that provide a direct connection to a surface water, we have to take that into account with the phosphorus index. So here in Pennsylvania, our results are as follows here. If we have basically a score that's at 79 or less, that's either a medium or low risk, and we can do a nitrogen-based rate. If our phosphorus index score is between 80 and 99, then we have to limit our phosphorus to the crop removal rate. And if our score is over 100, no phosphorus applications can occur to that field. I have some real world scenarios here. This is an actual example of this dairy operations transition from typical surface application. This is a no-till operation, so they had no incorporation, to dragline injection. So again, large dairy K-Fro, several million gallons. That's actually a slight understatement. This operation is about 40 million gallons of manure a year. This is actually right out of their 2022 nutrient management plan where they were implementing dragline injection. So in this particular case, what are the advantages of injection on this operation? So dragline injection, reduced cost per gallon to apply manure. So they are pulling manure directly out of their manure storages on their close fields, more or less. That equipment can run continuously without having to run back to the manure storage to fill a tanker and then get back to the field. So every minute that tractor's running, it's getting manure down on the ground, and you're not burning that diesel in between to simply run an empty tanker back to a manure storage. Increased nitrogen retention, as Amber mentioned. When we do the injection, we increase the amount of available nitrogen that's retained for the crop significantly. Even though this operation produces 40 plus million gallons of dairy manure a year, and farms, they farm several thousand acres, in the grand scheme of things of a nitrogen balance, they're still in a nitrogen deficit when it comes to crop production. And again, decreased impact of the phosphorus index. Now, with our dairy operations, they're closer in balance than maybe a poultry or a swine operation. With our dairies, they're typically growing mostly forages, so the phosphorus removal rate of those crops is higher, and the dairy manure itself is a little bit lower in phosphorus content. So it's a little easier to keep a balance there. When Amber was talking about nitrogen-based planning and the effects of the nitrogen-based rates, I think we're all pretty aware that if you apply manure at a rate to meet your nitrogen needs, you will almost universally over-apply phosphorus. So other advantages to manure injection are reduced migration of odor, offsite, and again, maintaining that no-till system, keeping that soil loss low, and again, reducing the impact of the phosphorus index. In this case, this operation was doing the injection for all of these reasons. They are in very close proximity to population densities. They are a no-till operation, almost all double crop rilage corn silage. Very aware of managing their phosphorus in the long term. Right now, again, we're like 20 plus years into using what is Pennsylvania's phosphorus index version 2. There's been talk for quite a while that phosphorus index version 3 will be coming out, and you can pretty well guarantee that that new index will pose additional challenges for managing phosphorus on farms. I haven't seen any specifics. I don't know if they're going to change the phosphorus threshold levels for the screening tool. I do know that I heard they will potentially use the soil loss on the particular year. So when we look at our conservation planning and using that soil loss rate from our conservation plan in the phosphorus index, that's soil loss over the rotation. If we look at a particular year, if we're in a corn and hay rotation, your corn years are going to have a higher soil loss than your hay years, and in turn will have a higher impact on your phosphorus index. So our nutrient analysis here, pretty typical dairy manure, about 20 pounds total nitrogen, about 10 pounds of ammonia, about 11 pounds of phosphate, and a little bit higher potash there at 48 pounds per 1,000 gallon. So I picked a suite of fields here out of their nutrient management plan. Pick these fields in particular because they basically show about everything you could run into on a phosphorus index. We have fields that are within 150 feet of surface water. We have fields that have modified connectivity. We have fields that are more than 150 feet from surface waters. The only thing that we don't check the box on is none of these fields are over 200 parts per million on phosphorus. So in our nutrient management plan, a typical farm operator map with our manure application setbacks here in Pennsylvania. In general, that's 100 feet from surface waters and wells. Of course, we need to know what type of soil we're doing the application on to determine what that soil drainage class is, and then our fields within 150 feet need to be designated in the screening tool. And then we can bring all of that information together in our phosphorus index. This is basically what our input looks like. So our screening tool, are we in a special protection watershed? Was there a significant change? What is our soil phosphorus test level? What's the contributing distance? Is it winter manure? And if we get a no for all of those, we don't have to run the phosphorus index. So in this case, this was the transition year for going from surface application to injection. To the question of how do we document that, or what do we do for record keeping? And in this particular case, I actually planned the entire farm as surface applied, not incorporated, and then provided a second set of recommendations in the appendix of the plan for the injection, so that the operator had the option to choose and that he could actually see what the impact was. So I don't have the nitrogen impact here, but I have the phosphorus impact here. It was fortuitous that I was asked to do this presentation and had a plan that met the needs perfectly. So what we see here are the fields that I had depicted on the map. This was the phosphorus index results for, I believe it was a 9,000 gallon per acre surface application. And as we can see, all of our soil phosphorus test levels right here are north or south of 100 parts per million. With the surface application, it all resulted in scores that allowed a nitrogen-based rate. If we move to the injection, we can see here that by going from a surface application in the spring with no incorporation to a surface application of injection, that we all but cut the impact of the phosphorus index in half. So, things to think about. In certain situations, injection can actually help get more manure on fields that are approaching limits of the phosphorus index. If we were to put all those fields up to or above 200 parts per million, I can guarantee you that it would have pushed the surface application with no incorporation probably into the phosphorus limited range, which probably would have reduced the application rate that was allowable. By doing the injection, it probably, I can almost guarantee it would have kept it in the range that would still allow that full 9,000 gallon per acre application. However, pushing the phosphorus index to its limits every year will still allow the increase of soil phosphorus levels. And eventually, regardless of what you do, you would hit a phosphorus limit. Typically in Pennsylvania, once we get fields up around 300 or 400 parts per million phosphorus, we're going to be extremely limited, if not completely restricted. Once we get soil phosphorus test levels in the 600s, you won't be getting manure on there frequently or at any rates that are going to be super beneficial for nitrogen. At the same time, in working the phosphorus index, we may generate a phosphorus index rate that allows additional manure, but we also have to make sure that we're keeping that nitrogen rate in mind, because we can never exceed a nitrogen rate here in Pennsylvania. So what may be allowed in the phosphorus index might not be allowed from a nitrogen side.
Thank you. Before I take over, I'm going to just ask you a couple of questions, Jedd. Do you have any concerns with increased phosphorus loss when you're injecting on tile drained fields?
Yes. Yes, that's taken into account in the phosphorus index. um, in the modified conductivity and or the subsurface drainage factors.
Okay. And then when you're using injection to intentionally lower P index scores and using injection, how do you advise a client on a long-term phosphorus management strategy?
Um, Typically by monitoring the soil phosphorus test levels from plan to plan. We can look at those side by side over time. If we see phosphorus levels increasing on particular fields, we would recommend reducing rates and pushing those applications on to fields that have lower phosphorus soil test levels. Um, and or exporting manure if we have to. Uh, you know, we're certainly going to have phosphorus be more of a concern as time moves on. Uh, that phosphorus index version 3 is going to take into account more factors, and it's going to have a higher impact on how we manage phosphorus.
And the last question I have for you at this moment is you mentioned that dragline eliminates empty tankers, reduces diesel consumption and emissions. And the question is, can this reduction be quantified in a farm's sustainability program?
Absolutely. You can certainly calculate the amount of time and energy usage based on tractor hours and factors like that, and compare that to the amount of gallons spread over time, and you would be able to calculate a diesel cost savings. You could calculate carbon emissions from the tractor, and also the injection is reduced volatilization of nitrogen and other uh, uh, environmentally, impactful things that come out of manure. Injection would be considered a climate smart practice, when we're looking at, greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay. So, as we're getting close to the end of our time together, I just wanted to kind of circle back to that slide that Amber started with at her presentation and, just revisit those three questions because they really frame how we are evaluating whether injection is the right fit for a particular operation with respect to nutrient management. First one, we have yield and rate, and how does the yield potential influence the manure rate? And as you heard today, injection is improving nitrogen retention, which means there's more available nitrogen to support higher yield goals, and it's more accurate for rate setting based on what the crop actually needs. But on the other side of the conversation, as Jedd talked about, injection also changes the phosphorus conversation because the manure is placed below the surface, we have less risk of phosphorus movement, which means that on some fields, especially those approaching P index levels and limits, injection can give us a slightly higher rate, but we always have to be cognizant of that phosphorus level over time that you're going to track in your soil test results. Second one, we have injection and manure use. How does injection change the total manure that can be used on a farm? And the answer, that we heard today was that injection can increase the volume of manure that can be applied because it lowers phosphorus loss potential. It also improves nitrogen efficiency. But again, for farms that are nearing the P index limit, this can extend the number of years that manure remains viable so long as we are managing the phosphorus levels through our soil testing and being cognizant of those. Timing and goals, there's lots of different reasons that people are going to adopt injection. Some of those are, that it captures more of the odor, that we're, being better neighbors, that we have stronger nitrogen availability to our crops. It's really conducive for a no-till operation because it maintains that um, it allows us to apply subsurface without disturbing the no-till scenario that exists on the farm. It can also help stretch our manure. There are some farms who have so many fields and not enough manure injection as a way to make those nutrients go a little bit further. But again, the practice only works when the timing supports the outcome that you want to achieve. So you really have to ask yourself, if you're advising a farm or if you are a farmer, what am I trying to get out of this practice, and how is the best way for me to manage my manure? You have to answer those questions honestly, because when it fits, manure injection can have a huge upside for operations, but it isn't the right fit for every operation. But when it is, it supports yield potential, it improves NUE, it extends manure coverage across an operation, and it really helps to align the timing of applications with the agronomic and environmental goals that many of us are so cognizant of and really interested in protecting. So success really just comes from matching the practice to the farm and not forcing the farm to fit the practice. So always having those conversations with the farmers that you are working with to make sure that they understand the full nutrient management as well as economic sides of injection is going to be critical to making sure that they can be successful in it. And in the 4R Alliance, we always talk about that when you're trying something new, you shouldn't do it on all your acres. You really need to pick the fields where it makes the most sense and where you feel like you can be the most successful, and start there, refine your process, and then expand beyond in order to really maximize the value and your likelihood of being successful with new practice adoption. Speaking of new practice adoption, if you or a farmer that you work with is interested in trying manure injection, and we are looking for new acres for this, there's an RFP coming out probably the beginning of 2026 for both applicators and agribusinesses to support manure injection, as well as to provide advanced nitrogen management services on injected acres. So if you have any interest in that, you can reach out to Natasha at Sustainable Chesapeake. Her information is there at the bottom, and you can get on the distribution list for that RFP to be notified when it opens and be considered for funding when that decision is being made. Amber and Jedd, I have one question for the two of you in the chat. At this point, if you are here for CEU credits, I just would ask you to again put your name and certification number, including your state, in the chat. Last question I have for you is just about the conversations that you're having with clients about injection. How often are you having conversations? Is it becoming more frequent? Would you say over the last 5 years? Just kind of getting a feel for the injection climate that exists out there in Pennsylvania or other states.
Overall, yes. Definitely having more conversations. In my experience, it seems to be the larger operations that have higher volumes of manure, particularly with the dragline injection. I would say nearly all of my large dairy clients, I'll define large by 1,000 plus cows, just about all of them are using dragline or dragline injection in some way, shape, or form.
The same thing as Jedd, essentially. That yes, I do think that more people are interested in using manure injection. I think I see a lot of, I would like to try and inject my duck liquid manure because it smells and I would like my neighbors to be slightly happier with me. For some of the swine operations, I think I've seen injection used for a couple years and then it switches back based on whether it's the pricing of the actual cost of the injection application or they just need to actually surface apply it because they need to use all of their manure and they're limited on acreage space. So,
Which is a great tie into my next question. Are there situations where injection results in a farm having to export manure? Is that good for their long-term phosphorus strategy? Is it a burden, or can it be both?
It can be both, and the answer is yes. In certain situations, um, particularly with swine or duck manure or liquid manures that are higher in nitrogen, it could reduce the rate. Those manures also tend to be higher in phosphorus. So, um, you know, looking at what the soil phosphorus test levels might be, even though you're reducing the rate, you're increasing that nitrogen availability. If your soil phosphorus background levels are adequate for a few, for or high, doing the injection to optimize the nitrogen and then exporting some manure to manage phosphorus would not be a bad thing.
yep. The same, I mean, Jed, I think you said it pretty concisely there. The only other comment that I would have is if you are decreasing your application rate just because you're utilizing your nitrogen more efficiently, you also will be less likely to overapply, or at least less likely to overapply your phosphorus at a much higher rate, which long term is beneficial for managing phosphorus on your operation.
All right. Again, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A. I'm also going to launch a poll that I would love your feedback on. As we continue as a Pennsylvania 4R organization, as well as a manure injection partnership group, to provide education and outreach on manure injection as a practice. We would love to understand what it is that you want to hear about, how it is that it's best communicated to you, so that we can tailor our future educational opportunities in a way that meets your interest and your um, preferred medium. So if you can just take a couple of minutes and answer these 5 questions for me before you sign off. Let me just double check the chat to make sure that there's no additional questions in there. It's looking like we have covered everything right now. So if you just want to go ahead and answer those questions for the poll, I would greatly appreciate your input, and we look forward to continuing to educate you on this topic. And hopefully you've found these 2 webinars to be helpful for your conversations with farmers and your planning